let's go to our study tonight, and I'm going to be in Genesis 11 is where I'm going to start, and I probably won't get done tonight, but that's okay because I can always finish it later or whatever. But Genesis 11, and I just remembered that I didn't put this on the notes in the church app, so if you use the church app, don't use it tonight because it's not in there. But in our study of hot topics, tonight we're going to talk about nations and borders. Nations and borders. There's been a lot of talk about a border over the last few years, really, but really in just recent months. This border, this wall, and all these things, and this invasion, and immigrants, and all of this different stuff. So tonight my goal is I want us to kind of go into the scriptures, and I want us to see what does the Bible say about these subjects. And I want to answer a couple questions as we go through, and I hope I'm successful in what I'm trying to do. I want us to think about it first. What does the Bible say? Not how do I feel, but what does the Bible say? And then I want us to be able to come to the conclusion where we can answer this question. How would God view what's happening in America today as it relates to nations and borders? Is it okay for a nation to have borders? Is it okay for a nation to have a wall? Is it okay to have an issue with people coming into your country, into your nation from another place? I think those are legitimate questions because they're real life things that we're facing and experiencing right now. And even if you haven't thought of it as biblically what's the answer, you've thought of it. Though maybe you didn't think of it that way. So let's dig into this tonight. I'm starting in Genesis 11 because I think that it is somewhat a starting point for what we would call a division of a world into different people groups, different places, and ultimately different nations. Genesis 11:1, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And everybody spoke English. Right? Maybe not, but it probably was. Probably Southern English, really. But verse 2, and it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and slime, and they have for mortar. Now, and they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Now, the problem with verses 1 through 4 is that God had just told them something else before. He told them to go and to populate the earth and to spread out. Man, as we often do, did the exact opposite of what God said. They said, let's don't spread out. Let's stay together here in this one place because when we're all together, we have greater power and we can accomplish more. And it really became a very prideful thing for them because this building or this tower that they're working on here is really meant to become something where they're almost shaking their fist in the face of God. Look what we can do. We can be up there where you are. So there's a lot going on here. I don't even get into all of that. Let's go to verse 5. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men built. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, this is God speaking, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Well, here we have introduced to us a mixture of languages. So it went from just English to English and Spanish and Hebrew and who knows what else, right? German and Latin and who knows what else happened at this moment. And then later on, those even spun into different languages probably. So that all began here. Verse 8, so the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. From this passage, I just want to draw this point and then kind of go into a study tonight called Nations and Borders. And here's the point. God is the one who created different languages, and he caused different people groups to form. God did that. And he did it intentionally for his purposes. So, is it okay for a nation to exist as a sovereign entity, maintain its borders, establish its laws to govern its people, and is that something that God approves of, particularly in the modern world where questions of national identity and global interdependence often collide? A biblical perspective offers clarity, affirming that nations have a God-given right to govern themselves, protect their territory, if you would, and establish laws for the good of their people. Now, told you the answer in the beginning, but now let's dig into this a little bit and see if we can get through at least most of it tonight. First, God sovereignly rules over the nations. The Bible makes it very clear that nations are a part of God's divine plan. He is the one who established them. We saw that in Genesis 11. You can also see that declared in Acts 17:26, that God made every nation that is on the face of the earth from one man, by the way, and that's another study for another time. But God is the one who established the nations, and he is the one who has given this establishing of nations a purpose. God has a divine purpose in the nations that exist in his world. He has a purpose for them. Now, that purpose is not always so clear to us, and if we had to sit down tonight and go through each nation and write down what the purpose of it was, we probably would have a hard time doing that. Because I live in America and I'm American, I have my own thesis, if you would, on what the purpose of America is. I believe I know, at least according to etymological terms I know. But each one has a very specific purpose, and it has a time in which God has established it to do something for him to ultimately carry out his will, and his kingdom work in this world. So God is the one who forms nations. God is the one who gives nations a specific purpose, and God then is the one who has established a nation to exist within and of itself and to sovereignly rule within and of itself. Secondly, because God has established nations, then biblically it is very appropriate for nations to have borders. If there were no borders, there would be no nations, because they would all be meshed together, is ultimately the point to be made there. It is biblical to have borders. Borders are not only a practical necessity, but also they are a biblical principle. The concept of nations having defined territories is completely rooted in Scripture. If you go and look in Deuteronomy 32:8, and I won't make you turn there, but it says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. And when you go through in the Old Testament and you study as God is sending his people into the land of Canaan, even in each of those instances, God clearly identifies what the borders of those places are to be. Now, it doesn't sound like it would for us, because if you go down to Durham and look in the book there, in the plot book or whatever, the plat book, it'll say, this point, and give all these numbers, and it'll say to this point, but in the Bible, it just says all the way over to this river. That's where it starts, and it goes all the way over to the sea, and he describes it that way. But the point in saying that is that God is the one who established the boundaries or the borders of those nations. He's the one that did that. So it is biblical, it is legitimate for a nation to have borders or boundaries. It is also biblical for us to respect the borders and boundaries of other nations. Listen, Deuteronomy 2:4-5 says this: God instructs Israel not to harass or provoke the people of Edom, because he had given them their land as their possession. This teaches us that we are to respect the sovereignty of another nation and their territorial rights. They have a right to be there. They have a right to have what they possess. So thus, it is wrong, if that's true, and I believe that is a clear point made in Scripture, it is wrong then if we decided tomorrow, hey, let's go attack Mexico, and let's take over Mexico. Or let's go attack Canada and take over Canada. We're just going to take it from them. That's wrong, because those places have a right before God to exist as a sovereign place, a sovereign nation, a sovereign people. It'd be wrong for us to do that. So they have the right then not only to have boundaries just like we do and borders, but we are to respect those boundaries and borders biblically as well. And if you understand what I'm doing here, I'm trying to go into Scripture and figure out, okay, is this okay? Is this all right? Is this biblical? Is this godly to have a border, per se? And if it is, then what is it to represent for us as another nation as we look at across the border to another land? What is our attitude supposed to be towards them and their boundary? And I believe the answer to that is it is biblical, and I believe we're to respect that boundary. There's not only a biblical basis for a place and a land having borders, but there's also a biblical foundation for a place having its own national laws as well. Romans 13, a passage that we've talked about many times in Hot Topics, Romans 13 teaches us and emphasizes the fact that we are to respect and obey the governing authorities that God has placed in our lives, and that's referencing specifically the government, and it also spells out, by the way, what that government and their laws are supposed to accomplish, which is to promote good, to punish wrongdoing, and to maintain order. That's what the purpose of those laws and that government is, so that when Romans 13 is saying that, as we said a while back when we studied in that passage, what it's saying there is, yes, we are to obey them, but this is what they're supposed to be doing. And thus, if they cease to do that, then it's going to change our relationship to them a little bit. It's going to change how we look at it. Now, we may not supposed to be in that situation, and I guess this is one of those things where what's going on to help us understand what we should do, but it's not a thing necessarily where we completely rebel from it, but there are times when we wouldn't obey government if government was not doing what God said it was supposed to do. Proverbs 29 states that where there is no vision, the people perish, but he that keepeth the law, happy is he. Laws provide moral and legal framework that, as a result of that framework, ensures the well-being of those who live within a nation. So the laws are there ultimately for the well-being of the people who are there. Those laws are necessary. So the preservation of laws is important, and then secondly, the preservation of a national identity is important. Think on this with me. God made these people groups different. One of the things that you notice in Genesis 11, and you begin to follow it, is that God intentionally, you remember, he confused the languages, so he made different languages, and it would make sense, Brian, and I would assume this is the case, that everybody that spoke Spanish got together at that point in time because they were the only people they could talk to, right? Because they didn't have any multilingual people at that time. Like Chad would have been hooked up, he'd been speaking Spanish and he'd been able to speak English, but that wasn't the case then. You either had one or the other because God had just given that to them. So those people congregated together and they established their own land. And as a result of that, here's what happened. Those peoples with those same languages also established specific cultures as well. And if you've ever traveled any on missions trips or maybe just on vacations, maybe if you vacate in other parts of the world, you've noticed that wherever you go, there's going to be some very definite cultures that are present there. And there's going to be things different about you if you're an American coming from America, from North Carolina, the tobacco capital of the world, and you go to some foreign country, you're going to notice that there's a different culture. They do things differently. They talk differently. They think differently. It's a different culture. And that's okay. I believe the Bible makes that fine. As a matter of fact, I think that's intentional on God's part that he makes that difference, because that's what he was trying to do anyway in the beginning of the Tower of Babel. He was trying to make them different so they weren't all together. That was his point. So it's okay for those places to have a national identity, if you would. It's okay for that. The Old Testament, I believe, gives us a picture of that. It allows for those people to be different. And by the way, one of the things that I understand is a struggle in international missions is going to a people that are very different from you, preaching the gospel, teaching them about Christ, them getting saved, and then knowing now, what do I teach them about how they should live? Because I want to respect their culture, but at the same time, I want to call them to Christ-likeness. So, and by the way, Christ-likeness, if you looked at, if there was a Bible dictionary that was written by God, Christ-likeness is not, you got to look just like this, right, with a tie on and a shirt, and you got to live in America. That's not what the Christ-likeness is necessarily. So one of the difficulties in missions is figuring out what do I teach them? Because I remember in Haiti, it was very common for a couple things to happen. One was a guy went out and found a woman he wanted to be his wife, but he just brought her home and she just became his wife. He started living with her. It's just like it just happened. And this is really exciting. Y'all will love this. Brian, he would go out and find her, and he would bring her home to where he grew up with his parents, and he would put a lean-to on the side of that building, and he would just make a bedroom for them right there, and they would live with his mom and dad forever. And they would have kids, and they would just do another lean-to, they just all live together. It's a very interesting, it's a very different culture. And by the way, we know that wouldn't work in America, amen? Got to be at least an hour from your mother-in-law, right? At least an hour, right? David, you're pushing it. You're only 20-something minutes, right? So, yeah, for sure. Yeah, today is David's birthday, by the way. I forgot to mention that earlier. And he's old. Yeah, so, yeah. There you go. You're somebody now, right? So, I'm sorry. Back to what we're talking about. These cultures are okay. It's okay for a different culture to exist. Now, if it's sinful things in a culture, we call them, hey, you can't just bring the woman home. We got to be married. We got to do this right. But if you want to live with your mother-in-law, that's your call, right? So there's things in these different cultures that are different from us. Some of them are okay. That's who they are. Sometimes it needs to change because it's not godly, it's not biblical, it's not Christ-like. But it's okay for that culture to exist. Now, as we talk about that, let's talk about the next step. Immigration. A person who says, okay, I was born in Eastern Europe, and I immigrated to the United States. I live in America now. Okay. Well, the Bible affords for that as well. As a matter of fact, listen to it. I don't know if you even knew this, but in Leviticus 19:34, it commands Israel to treat the sojourner, which is an immigrant, with kindness. But then, at the same time, in Exodus 12:49, the Bible emphasizes that there should be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. Now, here's what that means. Israel was told it's okay if somebody wants to immigrate to be with you and live with you. That's acceptable. That's acceptable. And you should treat that person with kindness. That's biblical. So what should our attitude be towards a person who immigrates to our land? By the way, we have a nation, we have borders, and we have laws, right? And so if a person immigrates to our land, they should have to do so. They have to come into this land legally, whatever that means. And by the way, every land that people determines what legally means. That's up to them. So they come in legally, and once they come into this land legally, we are, as the people who live in this land, in America, for instance, we are to respect those people and we're to treat them with great kindness. So we're not to be mean and hateful to them because they're from somewhere else, or they have a different accent than we do, or they look different than we do. We shouldn't be unkind to a person just because of that. However, that person is necessary. It is required that they do so according to the laws of this land, whatever they are. Does that make sense? So no, it is not okay, and we joke about this and whatever, and it's not a joking matter, but it's not okay if everybody in Mexico just decided to jump over, and come over here and just live here because they want to move here. That's not the law. We have laws to govern that. There is a way for a person legally to become a citizen of the United States if they choose to, and they have to go through a process just like, by the way, if you decide to become a citizen of another country. There are laws in that country that tell you how to do that, and it is the responsibility of that person who is now going to be an immigrant. It is the responsibility of that person to find out what those laws are and to obey those laws to go into that land. You follow me? You with me? Any thought or question about that before I move on? That's necessary. Now here's the next thing, okay? So grab your hats and hang on because this is important. I'm almost out of time. Here's the next thing though. Exodus 12:49 emphasizes that there should be one law for the native and the stranger who sojourns among you. Here's what that means. That immigrant legally, if they go through the right procedure, the right avenues to come to this land, it's okay. Respect them and be kind to them. But when they do, They are to come and live by the laws of this land and live in the culture of this land, not say your land now has to become like my land for me to live here. Now let's chase that rabbit for a moment, because what we see in America and all of our trying to be everything to everyone and trying to make sure that we never violate anybody else's rights or thoughts or feelings or anything else, and trying to be socially and politically and everything else correct, what we've done is we have tried to make it so that we can let another person come in here and then have their own culture and have their own land inside of our land. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. We will cease to be America if we change who we are. We're America. We're Americans. We have a culture of our own. We have laws of our own. Those things should stay the same. Yes, a pilgrim can come in here. Yes, an immigrant can come in here, and they can move to another place legally and come here. Yes, they can. But they cannot require that we become where they came from for them to be here. No, they left where they were from and came to where we are. That's biblical. That's biblical. And then just to go one step further, there are some groups in our world who intentionally immigrate individuals into another country for the very purpose of changing that country and its laws and its culture to make it like them. They're intentional on doing that. And some of those that are a group that is the most well known for doing that is those that are the extreme Muslim groups, Islamic groups. They go in, they populate, they get into the political world, and they begin to establish their own law and their own culture. And before long, you're no longer America, you're Americanistan then. It's happened all over the world. So yes, we are to respect immigrants, and you should. You should be kind to them. If they came here legally, they have rights to be here, and we should honor that. But when they come here, they have to realize they left their land and their culture and came to another land and another culture. And that doesn't mean they have to be completely just like me, thankfully, right? But it does mean they're in a different land now, and they need to realize that. That's biblical. It's a biblical concept. They must abide by the same law God told them. Meaning, whatever your law is, that man who comes and lives with you is going to have to obey that law as well. And that is, I believe, a biblical precedent, if you would, for a person who would be an immigrant and come into the land, whatever the land is. In our case, it would be the land of America. We must be aware of those who would want to come in and change our culture entirely. We don't want that. Because we cease to be us. We cease to be who we are if that happens. Cultures are always changing slowly, but they're not becoming another land. It's just us becoming different than what we were before. That's not what I'm describing. I'm describing a person who comes in and says, now, you've got to do this like this because this is how we did it there. That's not so. That's not so. You come to this land, you have to take on the identity largely of this land. That doesn't mean that in your own family, in your own home, you have to eat cheeseburgers and steaks and baked potatoes. That's not what I'm describing. That's okay. You can continue to be what you are in your home, but you can't demand for society to change to represent where you came from. And I think that is a very important point to be made and something to think on. I'm going to stop there because I know that there's no reason for me to even try to go any further, because then I'll just make somebody mad because they'll be like, man, I was going to go home tonight. It's Wednesday. It's been a long day.